I'm really excited about our special guest today, Andy Crouch. I've already been talking about his book, and I just learned that he's also the author of Culture Making, Recovering Our Creative Calling, which you read in your music appreciation class, right? So you're already somewhat familiar with his thinking. He is the executive editor of Christianity Today. He's also involved with, as a senior fellow at the International Justice Mission, which many of PHC students are involved with. He was a campus pastor at Harvard with InterVarsity for a number of years. And he's just a very accomplished Christian leader and Christian writer and Christian thinker. His latest book, Playing God, Redeeming the Gift of Power, I think really addresses the postmodernist notion that kind of reduces everything, culture, religion, ethics, politics, to just the pursuit of power and of oppressive power. And what impressed me about that book is he takes that seriously, and he does show the abuses of power, including in church situations, and alerts us to that. But he shows that that's a distortion of power. It's a kind of playing God. It's an idolatrous approach to power. But then he counters that with a biblical approach to power, which shows its proper use. How God uses his power for creation and for helping other people to flourish. And in his gift of power to us, which you can see vocationally, that's what Christians can do to really redeem that gift of power. So I'm very excited to have him here. Please welcome Andy Crouch.
Thank you.
Well, Andy, thank you for coming.
It's a pleasure.
And we are about an hour away from the major power center of America. And it's a center to which Christians have wanted to come, aspired to be involved in it over the past few decades. There's been a lot of Christian involvement in politics, and we start out with a very general question, then we can zoom on this. Has much of the power seeking within the Christian community thinking about Washington, has it been more biblical or more idolatrous?
Well, here's how you know if you are unwittingly in the service of an idol.
Okay.
One way you know is idols promise big results up front. At relatively low cost. And often they deliver initially, it's just that they don't keep delivering. And so one test of whether your seeking of any kind of power is idolatrous or kind of truly faithful is what kind of results am I looking for here, and how quickly. My sense is that maybe, often without fully intending it, that some of the Christian enthusiasm for getting involved in politics over the last generation anticipated a kind of quick results, relatively easily achievable, that probably was never actually possible. And that even if it had been achieved, or to whatever extent it was achieved through winning elections and acquiring certain kinds of positions, didn't deliver nearly as much as we hoped. And the idol's way of offering power is to say it's going to cost very little, it's going to have very quick, impressive results, but then fail to deliver even while the cost goes up and up. Whereas when you serve the true God, often the initial results are tiny. So Pentecost, the day of Pentecost, there's 120 people in the whole world who are attached to this crucified Messiah, Jesus. And even 100 years later, maybe 20,000 out of the whole Roman Empire But 400 years later, more than half the Roman Empire has come to faith. And so when you serve the true God, the kind of power the true God unleashes in the world starts very small, and it actually is extremely costly in a way, asks a lot of us, asks kind of a deep sacrifice of us, but in the very long run bears this kind of crazy abundant fruit. So the question would be, I don't know, I mean, were we willing to invest in that kind of multi-hundred-year fruitfulness as we re-entered the public square? And I would guess maybe we weren't aware of that.
So is it like a drug of some sort where you have the initial hit and so forth, but it takes more and more to get really less and less?
Yes, exactly. So I think addiction, our modern concept of addiction, maps very closely onto how idols work. So idols promise, yes, they really do work at first, but diminishing returns and accelerating or increasing demands. And that's the pattern of all idols, whether they're political idols, religious idols as well, or substances, the kind of substances we're able to worship as if they were God.
Yeah. Or let me throw out another analogy. Is it somewhat like writing, whereas if it comes too easily, it's probably not very good.
Yes, which is why when people say to me, "Oh, I love writing,"
Right.
They find out I'm a writer and they say, "Oh, I love writing." I think, "Oh, you're not a writer."
Yeah. Right.
If it's that easy for you, I don't think you're really a writer, and I probably don't want to read what you write because it's probably not good enough. It hasn't been suffered enough.
Yeah. So is this where the subtitle "Redeeming the Gift of Power" comes in? That if it's that in some way the gift has to be redeemed? If it's go. How did you come to that particular subtitle?
That's a really good question. Well, there are a couple things going on in there, and one is simply to reintroduce the idea of power as a gift.
Okay.
Because the number one thing people say when you tell them you're working on a book or an essay or whatever about power, they quote one person and one aphorism above all others, and you know what it is.
Power corrupts.
Power corrupts, Lord Acton said power tends to corrupt.
Yeah.
And absolute power corrupts absolutely. And people, I mean, I wish that I could collect, 5 cents for every time I've heard that. And that entails the idea that power is not a gift, that power is actually a problem to be managed. But actually, I want to reclaim this idea that I think is more deeply biblical, that it's part of the vocation of human beings to have and exercise power, to steward power. But it has been corrupted by idolatry and also injustice, which is kind of idolatry's twin. And so it needs to be redeemed. There needs to be a story that takes us past power as we know it right now, which is corrupted by the fall, to a reclaiming. And of course, the great thing about the Christian story is we never just rewind to the original gift, but what unfolds through salvation history is actually better than even what was given at the beginning. And that's the full meaning, I think, of redeeming the gift of power.
Interesting. Have we tended to have a kind of triumphalistic view of power? There was a book a few years ago thinking about titles. It was called Evangelicals in the Halls of Power.
Right.
And it was celebrating essentially that here, yes, they're welcome to Congress, welcome to this. And is that a problem?
I think it can be. If when we read a book like Faith in the Halls of Power and we say, "Hey, we've arrived," the thing is, once you've arrived in a position of power, now the real work, sacrifice, and challenge begins. Because what's the template for power? It's, of course, the way God exercised power at the beginning and then throughout the whole story. And God exercises his creative power at great risk and ultimately at great cost. So great risk in creation of actually creating this world with degrees of freedom in it that would, on the one hand, allow his image bearers to flourish, but also, so it makes Genesis 1 and 2 possible, but it also makes Genesis 3 through 11 possible. So once you've arrived in power, you actually are exposed to much more risk than you were before. And you also, as those risks play out, you become accountable in a way for more suffering than you were before and bearing more than you were before. Yeah, so if triumphalism means we think now we've got our hands on the levers and we can just push the lever and things will happen, we have a very sub-biblical picture of what power is, because that's not all what it's been like for the Creator God in relation to his creation.
So often in reading books about political campaigns, you have all the emphasis and excitement and tension is in winning the campaign, and it's a typical scene. Then in the morning, the next day, they say, "Oh, we've won. Now what?"
Yes.
You don't get that sense from God
Yes.
that He creates the universe and everything in it, and then He's saying, "Well, what do we do now?" But that
Right.
does seem to be the sense with man.
Wow. We want easier stories than we ever can actually get, right?
Yeah.
And maybe that's not all wrong to yearn for that kind of climax and resolution, points to something we're made for, but it's not where we live now, is it?
No, it's not. And let me take you through a few of the statements in the book and just ask you to press on these, even at the risk. I'm sure you've been asked about a lot of this over the past few months. But here on page 33, God's creative act brings forth not carefully regimented sets of creatures, but swarms of them. Swarming and teeming are part of what makes the world good, the overflow and excess of life. You have a sense from population control people, zero population growth and so forth, that the teeming is a problem. We hate it. We need to be ordered. How do you fight that? Is there this? How do you renew this biblical sense of teeming and excitement and just all things bursting out all over?
Yeah. Well, I would believe that human beings have a built-in attraction because we're made in the image of God. I think you actually have to work very hard to convince human beings to give up their attraction to abundance and diversity. And so you actually have to, if you believe, for example, that the abundance of human beings is a problem, I think you actually are working incredibly uphill to convince people of that. So I think those kind of arguments are driven by fear and a scarcity mentality that are not the way we were created. We were created to live in and indeed foster abundance in the world. But we've bought into these scarcity stories. So I suppose what you would have to do is you have to start telling abundance stories again. And for example, talk about how human beings actually, when they tend and care for the world well, lead to flourishing in the world. So someone who has done this, who's quite amazing, is Sir Gillian Prance, who is a biologist in the UK, obviously highly recognized. He's been done whatever they do that makes you be able to be Sir Gillian. They've done it to him. I'm such an American. I don't even know what that's called. I don't know if he's knighted or whatever. Anyway, Sir Gillian has spent his life studying the biology of the tropical rainforest and what causes the tremendous ecological diversity of the rainforest. Well, it turns out, and he has demonstrated this in articles in Nature and Science and the very top peer-reviewed journals, that actually the biological diversity of the rainforest is the result of human interaction with the ecosystem of the rainforest. Not human interaction in the sense of paving the rainforest or turning it, for that matter, into grazing land, which is happening now in Brazil, but pre-technological interaction by human beings. Human beings have been in the rainforest for eons, and it's their kind of cultivation of the rainforest that creates more ecological layers and niches and leads to this abundance that we see and value in the rainforest. He also talks about the British Isles, his own home country, which before human beings settled them were just a monoculture of oak. It was just oak trees as far as the eye could see, but there were no eyes to see it, not human eyes. Human beings come, they start to settle, they start to clear, and you know how when you go to the UK, you're struck by just the beauty of how human beings have tended the landscape. Well, all those hedgerows and stone walls and so forth actually create this abundance of niches, which leads, among other things, to an abundance of birds. The UK has more species of birds, pound for pound, than any other place in the world, and this is why the Brits are such enthusiastic bird watchers. There's so many birds to watch. It's human beings tending the British Isles that led to this incredible diversity and abundance. Now, this is not what our neighbors think, right? We think, oh, wherever human beings go, you have loss of species abundance. No, when human beings do what they're meant to do, you get diversity and teaming.
That's interesting. And we don't hear that.
You don't hear that story. So we have to tell this story. And also, of course, have to back it up with living in ways that are consonant with that, because if you do pave it all, you do lose abundance.
Yeah. You then say that much as God says, be fruitful and multiply, that the job of, let's say your job, my job as magazine editors, essentially is to, we should say, be fruitful and multiply to the people we employ and empower for the work. Fill the space created by our early vision with your own creativity. So, our job as magazine editors, or Ed Veith's job as provost, is to create a situation in which people can flourish.
Yes.
Right? That's what it comes down to. And tell people then, team, fill the space, have fun.
Yes.
Okay.
I experienced that. Did you want to follow up?
No, please, go.
Well, I experienced this in a very vivid way as the executive producer of documentary films. So that sounds like a very important role. And in a limited way, it is. I'm very involved at the vision stage and often the resource provision stage. But the funny thing is, when you go out on an actual shoot, so now you've got the director, you have the director of photography, maybe a sound, depending on the crew size. Of course, you have your subjects. And then you have me. And if you looked at what's happening as we're actually shooting, and you tried to pick out who is the least important person in this whole endeavor, you would absolutely point at me. Like I look, and you would, I can't run the camera, I can't frame the shot, I can't run the sound. Like I am absolutely vestigial in this whole process. And these other people are doing their thing and flourishing as they do their thing. And I'm really just watching and celebrating and saying, like God says on the sixth day, this is very good. And that's the job of the leader, is to set up the conditions where these other people now can do stuff. And you just say, that's awesome. I can't believe you did that. I couldn't have done that. So great.
Yeah. And the same thing then, I suppose, a teacher in the classroom. You are not trying to control it. You are saying, be fruitful and multiply.
Yeah. So I'm really trying to reframe our understanding of power from the imperative mood, which just gives commands. And in limited domains, the imperative mood is important. But I'm trying to reframe it to these other moods of the verb in Genesis 1, which aren't the imperative. They're saying, let there be this, and let's make this together. And now you guys go make something very different from just commanding and controlling.
Yeah. Page 37, it can seem that the whole history of power is one long story of perversion and betrayal. In fact, if I were not a follower of Jesus Christ, I might believe that was the deepest truth about power. So how do you, let's say these days when we look at Washington, and it's hard not to be cynical about the process and to emphasize the lying that goes on and so forth. How do you keep from starting to see all of Washington as one long story of perversion and betrayal?
The main way I keep from becoming cynical is I try not to pay too much attention. The honest truth is I limit my exposure to the reality of what's happening. The deeper answer, I think, is I honestly try to balance, like, what is my diet, because the truth is, it isn't just the reality of what's happening. It's also the way it's being framed and reported. I was on the Hill back in July, trying to advance some perspectives on immigration reform. And actually, when I'm in the office of a member of Congress, interacting with that person, who maybe we disagree about either the end goal or the steps to get to that goal, but when I'm with that person, more often than not, I actually leave fairly hopeful. But when I watch the news about what that person is doing and see it framed, often by the framing really matters, then I can easily become cynical. But there are very cynical people in almost every system. And if you hang out with those cynical people, you will become a cynic. But in those same systems, there are people who manage to work with all the constraints of it and not become kind of fatally cynical. So, I also immerse myself in this bigger story of Scripture, which says God's at work in bigger and deeper ways than we can imagine. And there were plenty of reasons to be cynical in the first century of the Common Era. My goodness. I mean, the pattern of power that each successive generation of emperors was taking on, more and more godlike attributes being ascribed to the emperor until eventually the emperor demanded to be worshipped as God, exactly as the emperor was now delivering less and less actual peace and security to the empire. So this is the pattern of idols all over again. Yeah. I mean, if you wanted to be cynical, you could be. And yet here's Paul saying, I got to get to Rome because the gospel needs to be at this place. And Jesus is going to do his work in Rome just as he did in Jerusalem and Galilee. And so I think you can move even to the centers where there's plenty to be cynical about and maintain hope.
So was it Hubert Humphrey, a generation or more ago, who used to be called the Happy Warrior? Or was it someone else? I'm not quite sure. Maybe
right.
Humphrey.
I know
but who are the happy warriors in American politics these days? People then, who are not Pollyannish.
Right.
They recognize the reality, but still they've been able to avoid becoming cynical. Anyone strike you that way?
Well, I know.
I'm not asking for an endorsement or things like that. I'm just curious.
I know who I think of. They aren't people. The folks who come to mind are not in direct political office, but they're engaged in these issues. And the number one person I would think of is Robbie George at Princeton.
Okay.
And, I remember thinking about that very phrase, happy warrior, when I interviewed Robbie a few years ago. And I was doing a whole series of stories that impinged on kind of culture of life issues and other very highly contested issues. And it was Robbie, and then it was Frederica Matthews Green, who you know really well, and a few other people. And here's the interesting thing they all had in common. They were not raised as evangelical Protestants, and so they did not have a sense of having lost a kind of defining battle.
Okay.
And what I've realized is there are three things that I think distorted American Protestantism in the 20th century in its engagement with the wider culture in various combinations, and they were, in no particular order, fear, envy, and grief. When you start relating to the wider culture out of fear or out of envy, this would be more the mainline Protestant mistake, I think, to say, wow, such good stuff is happening out there, we need to be more like that, and we wish we had the power and access that they have. Or grief, which I think was the kind of ex-fundamentalist or post-fundamentalist reaction. We used to run this, we used to control this, and now we don't anymore. I think you are in great spiritual danger. And what struck me about Robbie and about Frederica, and I've met other people like this, is how free they are of those three things. And instead they have this kind of joyful, almost boisterous confidence that they have something good to offer. And we may or may not win this battle, or we may lose the war, but it's still good, and it's still news, and it's still good news, and we're going to keep going. So that's who comes to mind, at least.
Yeah. Now, I'm still celebrating the Red Sox victory in the World Series recently, and it strikes me that a lot of the Protestants you mentioned here are like old Red Sox fans prior to 2004, when the Red Sox had 86 years of misery and always losing at the last moment and so forth. And what you're
They're
saying
like Cubs fans today.
That's right. That's right. So whereas Red Sox now 3 World Series victories over the past decade. So Red Sox fans versus Cubs fans. Evangelicals have to be more like the new Red Sox as opposed to the old Red Sox. So anyway, let's move on from this. But
I will say, though, I have the scorecard from Game 6 of the 2004 Division Series against the Yankees. That unbelievable game where Pedro Martinez came back in and almost lost the whole thing. And, I have that framed on my wall.
Okay.
That victory that showed that there is a God after all. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I have framed on the wall of my office in Asheville, my world office, 2 shots of Dave Roberts stealing the base in the 4th game of that series.
Yes.
And that's the turning point in world history.
Yes,
but
right.
Anyway, moving on. Page 45. So far from being absolutely corrupted by the absolute power parenthood confers over a new human being, Many parents find themselves awakening to new capacities for resilience, sacrifice, and servanthood that they know than they know they had before.
Yeah.
Basically, end quote. So parenting gives us a good view of power and the good uses of power.
Yeah, it's the falsifier for Lord Acton's dictum.
Yeah.
Because if there's anyone in my whole life that I've had something very close to absolute power over, it's my children when they were small, when they were infants. I mean, I had incredible amounts of power just at a physical level, not to mention emotional and spiritual level. And did I handle that power perfectly? No. But was I absolutely corrupted or nearly absolutely by that near absolute power? No. In fact, I'm a far better human being for having been entrusted with that power. Right. So yeah, that to me is it's that clue, it's that sort of chink in the absolute statement of Lord Acton that makes us realize, no, there's another way to have a lot of power and yet not be corrupted by it. And of course, it involves the transforming power of love. And so the more I'm transformed by love, the more perhaps I can be trusted with certain kinds of power that I could not be trusted with otherwise. You know, there is an incredible example of this that's somewhat painful to bring up. But we know that the abuse of children, both physical and sexual, is a real problem in our society and every society. But what we often do not disaggregate is that the abuse of children happens overwhelmingly at the hands of step-parents, especially stepfathers. One of the most vulnerable things to be is a young child with a stepfather in the house, unfortunately. Not because every stepfather, of course, and most stepfathers are very loving, but statistically speaking, abuse is perpetuated by people who are in a situation of great intimacy, authority, and power without the kind of love that a biological father will have for their child. And again, this obviously many stepfathers are very faithful to that calling, but that's that severing that link between that kind of intrinsic love and power is a perilous thing for parents and children.
Yeah.
I noticed that your mic will need to be reattached for people to be able to hear you.
Oh, that's right. I've lost it here. I guess thinking about the Red Sox just got me so excited. But
we've seen Marvin at his most animated here. This is really gets him out of his seat.
That's right. Now, when children become teenagers, of course, parents lose that absolute power.
Exactly.
And some mourn that, but again, this is team, be fruitful and multiply, and so forth.
Right.
So anyway, interesting. Okay, now, idolatry, this is page 55, another lapidary line here, if I may say so. Idolatry is the biblical name for the human capacity for creative power run amok. Yeah. Play that out a little bit.
Yeah. So human beings are invested by their creator with this creative ability to make something of the world and ideally to make the world flourish. But instead, what they do is they make the one thing they were not supposed to make, which is images of God. They make God's substitutes. They themselves are the image of God. Yeah. But out of reaction in a way to the kind of instability of being both a creature who is also the image of the creator, that instability to which the serpent appeals in Genesis 3, human beings turn their creativity to this other task of making things out of the world that purport to represent ultimate reality. And they displace their own image-bearing function, if you want to put it that way, onto these created things that cannot actually bear the weight of bearing the image. The only one who can make an image of God successfully in the world is God. Human beings are commanded not to make images of God, but God has actually made to date 7 billion images of God, or at the moment 7 billion images of God. But all of those image bearers misuse their creativity to make these substitute images. And the world, which was meant to be full of, be fruitful, multiply, was meant to be full of true images, is now actually full of idols, full of false images. And such is the creativity that we have that we're able to turn almost anything into a substitute for God and to displace our image-bearing role onto that thing.
Yeah. We do ask about a couple other things, and then we'll open it up for questions from y'all. Page 75. You say there's a problem when, and I'll quote here, when we begin to believe that the only thing lacking in a needy world is our own will. That if we choose, we can end poverty and provide water and stop slavery and cure disease. In a world of omnipotence with our ability to change the world taken for granted, charity becomes a matter of marketing, simply persuading the powerful to use their godlike powers for good, end quote. Yeah. Now, there's been a number of books the past few years with titles like When Helping Hurts and so forth. Yep. Good stuff about that. Well, how do we think about poverty around the world and helpful? How can we think about this in a helpful way rather than a way that just tries to assert our power and basically create an idol?
Yeah. So this is something I first gleaned from the British writer Dorothy Sayers in her book, The Mind of the Maker, which is about creativity. Mm-hmm. And she has this wonderful, I think it may even be like an appendix or very near the end, there's this chapter on why we should not think of the world in terms of problems that need solutions. And it's just very interesting. I mean, Dorothy Sayers just always looks at things from a different angle. And it's so interesting. She says, this is an engineer's mindset. When you look at the world and you think, here's a problem, and how do we solve this problem? And she says, all of the most interesting things in human life are not problems that have solutions in that engineering way. Now, if you want to span a river with a bridge, that's an engineering problem with a domain of solutions, and you can solve that problem and you can build the bridge. But she says, when John and Mary meet and begin to fall in love, is that a problem with a solution? You know, right. And then when the baby comes along after they're married, hopefully, and they have the baby, is that baby a solution to a problem, or is it itself a problem that needs to be solved? No, like there's this whole realm of human existence, which is actually the deepest, most important part of our realm that is not made up of problems with solutions. So I would say, and this may be a very counterintuitive thing to say, I would think the first step towards a better approach to the relief of poverty in the world would be to stop thinking about poverty as a problem. Stop thinking about it as a problem, because we technological human beings coming of age in this technological world think that what you do with a problem is solve it. Mm-hmm. And you solve it by the application of sufficient amount of expertise and power, often very literal, electrical power, just harnessing the concentrated energy of the sun and the natural world, and you drive solutions toward a problem. The problem with that is that poverty is an experience of human beings who are made in the image of God. And when you come in with your technological bulldozer to solve their problems, you are actually not addressing the fundamental issue of poverty, which is the failure of image bearing. The social conditions and the historical conditions that have made it impossible for these people to see themselves as agents of flourishing in their own story. And a lot, I think, we know famously now that the billions of dollars of aid that were invested in Africa since the World War II, Africa has a lower GDP now. I forget whether it's absolute or per capita, but a lower GDP now than it did when the colonial era ended, after billions of dollars were spent. And I think it's because they were spent in highly technologized ways that did not address the patterns of image bearing and idolatry and injustice in a deep enough way.
Let me ask one more, and then we'll go to questions here. This is a nice expression here. This is on page 199. You talk about zombie institutions.
I'm just very happy to hear a quote from something after page 50, because I was getting worried that you only read the first 60 pages of the book.
That's right. Well, again, I don't know if anyone has ever given you the supreme compliment that I received in one of my books, where a person came up to me after a talk and said, I really like this book that you wrote. I read a page every night before I fall asleep. So, anyway.
You got that far. Wow.
But here I got to page 199.
I love it.
And, quote, more and more resources of time and money go into the appearance of power, while less and less go into its actual exercise in ways that would create opportunity and true wealth. So what do you do when you have a lot of zombie institutions? How do you start changing that?
Yeah.
This is a problem to be solved.
Yes, right. How do you kill a zombie? And there are these institutions that basically now exist for their own preservation, not for any flourishing. I think there might be a couple things. Some of them, there are some institutions that not only are not serving any good, any ongoing good, but will never be able to do so again. And those need to be eliminated. And so what we need are prophets, essentially. Prophets are basically people who say difficult truths about power. We need prophets who are able to say, while everyone else is trying to avoid the issue, this institution is not working. So what we needed in 2007 was for someone to say, these more and more elaborate securitized instruments that are slicing and dicing mortgage debt, this is unsustainable. This is not actually creating flourishing. It's creating an illusion of flourishing. And if we had had prophets with the standing to say that, we might have been able to kill that institution in a less bloody way than the financial crisis of 2008, 2009. But then I think there are other institutions. I would put a lot of churches in this category. I think a lot of churches end up being about their own maintenance rather than about the mission of flourishing that they're meant to be about. And we don't just want to give up on the church. So then you need what in the book I call trustees, which is different from prophets. We need prophets, but prophets can be a real pain. Right. And part of the reason prophets are a pain is sometimes they stand outside the walls and just complain about what's happening. And sometimes you have to have that person because no one inside is willing to tell the truth. Mm-hmm. But if that institution is going to change, you need someone inside the walls, in the king's court, who is willing to say, here's what we could do to actually address the inequities here or to address the idolatries that this institution has become about. And you have to have people who start to patiently, creatively rebuild within them and who are not going to give up on the institution. And of course, that's what you needed in 2009. You can't just give up on the global financial system. I think that would be a diminishment. But you needed, did we find these people? I don't know. But do we need people who would move into that system and say, how can this be healthier? How can this be more connected to the real flourishing for which we're made? We've got to have those kind of trustees, or we will have, the zombies will do more damage in the long run.
Yeah. So if any of the students here become evangelicals in the halls of power, then the goal should be not to spend your time kissing up to folks, nor to spend all your time complaining, but to in some way be creative to make things work within that. But anyway, those are just that's a deep philosophical statement. Now we can turn to any questions you all have.
That'd be great.
Or maybe not. Surely there must be questions. There's a hand over there.
As you're a person that's an editor of a magazine and you're involved in a lot of multimedia with the documentaries you make, and Christianity Today has a lot of multimedia facets on the website. So how do you think that multimedia will impact journalism in the future?
Wow, great question. Well, we are entering, I think, the third great age of humanity, which is the kind of sweeping statement for which journalists hope not to become known. But orality was the first, literacy was the second, and now we're entering the age of visualcy. And what this means is it's a shift in where meaning resides when you communicate. In an oral culture, if you want to say something deeply meaningful, you put it in, you speak it. So the epic poems that were spoken aloud by bards, the Psalms, these were all originally spoken first of all. And it's secondarily written down, if at all. In a literate culture, if you want to say something really meaningful, you write it down. And people still talk in a literate culture, but if they really have something important to convey, they put it into writing or print. In a visual age, if you have something really important to say, you will create an image. and ideally a moving image, a film or something like film. And yes, you'll still talk like we're doing now, and you'll still write like Marvin and I do, but it's very significant how this conversation is happening. There's a moving image being made of it. And one of the things I say about American life now is you are not real in American life until you've appeared on a screen. And the more screens you've appeared on, the more real you are. Which is why if people really love their friends, they try to get them on screens. Because now you're real if you've been on screens. It's meant to be a paradox because, of course, a screen is a very unreal thing. This is real. What's happening here is real. But strangely, the recording of this will be in some ways more compelling than the real thing was. That's the power of images in a visual age. So that's the background to saying, how is this going to change the way we do journalism? It's going to complicate it because the other thing about the visual age is that it is immediately gripping. There's something about images that are immediately gripping in a way that words are not. However, images are not self-interpreting. Even the most carefully assembled sequence of images, like any filmmaker attempts to make, or any serious photographer or painter attempts to represent, it's unspeaking. It's mute. Even if it has a soundtrack and even if it has a voiceover, it's limited in its interpretive ability, and you have to have words to interpret it. The problem is our audience is not reading anymore. They're just watching. And they're kind of letting this visual world wash over them, produce very deep feelings in them, probably deeper than words would, but without interpretation. It's a little like what Paul says in a way about speaking in tongues without interpretation. We now have this kind of spiritual language that we and our neighbors are bombarded with by every day, the spiritual language of images, but it's not being interpreted. So to me, the challenge is to make sufficiently compelling visual presentations that I engage people, but then lead them to words that can interpret. And then to make my writing sufficiently vivid and engaging that even a visual age can engage with it. That's the huge challenge. Can we do it? I don't know. Am I good enough to do it? Probably not, but that's what the next generation of great journalists will do. They will make very compelling images, but they will tie that to really deep interpretation in the form of language.
And by the way, if any of you are fascinated by this idea here of the more screens you are, the more real you seem, Walker Percy really got to this in his first novel, The Moviegoer, which is about 50 years old right now, but then some of his subsequent books, so I recommend those. Other questions? Okay.
I personally am very fascinated with the idea of the evolution of human communication and the way that different eras have communicated in different ways. We've had moving images for a while. Do you see any movements or evolution toward perhaps even the next great paradigm shift? Because it seems that the eras get shorter and shorter. We had oral for a very, very long time, and then writing, and then where do you see this going in the future?
Oh, goodness. Having proclaimed the new era of visualcy, we need to move on to the next era. Let's go. I don't know. I actually think this is, I'm not sure I do see a horizon yet. I think we're at the very beginning of the era of visualcy. I would bet on this being a 500-year thing, at least. Print has been roughly 500, right? Or maybe almost exactly, right? Gutenberg Bible, 500 coming up, I think. So I think, so no cultural pattern is fully entrenched until it's been present for 3 generations. The 3rd generation comes of age with that just being completely part of the furniture. Alan Jacobs, a friend of mine, just tweeted yesterday. He says, I'm of the generation that is old enough to remember when video stores didn't exist, and also we're the only generation that will remember when video stores did exist, right? So talk about a trend that came and went. But on the other hand, you think about, say, mobile phones, right? Cell phones or whatever. The younger ones in the room really can't remember a time when that didn't exist. And so you're like the first generation that is growing up with that just being part of the fabric. Well, multiply out a couple generations from now where that is just woven into every facet of culture, and I think you start to see how deeply things change. And I don't think we're there with the moving image, because it's going through the phase transition that several media have gone through, which is the cost of production originally with the printing press is concentrated in the hands of those who can afford that industrial thing called a printing press. I was just at the Washington Post Company a couple weeks ago, and as you walk into the Washington Post Company, there's a linotype machine in the entranceway. This massive, incredibly expensive industrial thing that you used to have access to. Well, suddenly the price of producing writing falls off a cliff. You no longer need a linotype. You no longer even need to print anything. And we're just hitting that with visual communication, where we now all can shoot amazing quality video with our smartphones. I think you don't know how that's going to change culture for 3 generations. You need 3 generations of that fully entrenched before it starts really reshaping. So what's beyond that? 3D, holograms, the olfactory age, like, we'll move, it's all going to be about aroma. I think visual is so compelling, it's going to drive culture for, I would bet 1,000 years. I don't think it's going to end quickly.
That's, let me just mention, as far as the olfactory emphasis, that if any of us went on a time machine back a couple hundred years or more, I think that would be, of our 5 senses, that would be the one that would
yes.
most assault us, and the difference would be sharpest.
Yes,
there.
yes, wow,
So
amazing.
a world without deodorants.
We live in a scent-impoverished environment in modernity, but man, yeah.
Okay, next question.
Yes.
I actually have 2 questions for you. The first is when you were talking about poverty and you said it shouldn't be a problem, but can you give some specifics on how we should not treat it like a problem, so how you should change the current system? And then the second question was actually about your time at Harvard. How did you encourage those students when they were about to springboard into positions of incredible power and monetary success to keep the correct mindset?
Yeah, wow, both wonderful questions. Wow, kind of 2 ends of the spectrum, right? How do we deal with poverty and incredible privilege? So there is a wonderful development tool that's being used in a lot of relief and development now called asset-based community development, ABCD. And the essence of this approach to going into a community that may be very materially poor is that you begin by asking what resources the community has. Mm-hmm. So you go into a village, let's say, and you or I would walk in and we would immediately see children without shoes, people bathing in very dirty water, perhaps people drinking very dirty water, people cooking over open pits in homes with lots of smoke. And we'd say, oh my gosh, I could list 12 public health problems just without even turning around. But instead of saying in that setting, help us list the problems you have, and let's start prioritizing your problems and figuring out which one we solve first, which would have been, now this would have been an improvement over coming in and just saying, oh, I see your problems and I'm going to fix them now. Like the next phase was, oh, let's talk about your problems and fix them. ABCD says the first question you ask is, what is going best in your village? What are the greatest resources that you have? What are you most proud of in your village? And this takes a tremendous amount of discipline for a Westerner to do, because we immediately see what we think are problems, and we often can't even spot any assets. Yeah. We're like, oh, this is just poverty. But in fact, what you're beginning to do is you're establishing a pattern that says the members of this community are the agents of its own flourishing, and they probably are sustaining something that they very much value right now. And you start with that, and you say, how can we build on your strengths? The truth is, all of us have experienced this in our own development. If your parents or your teachers every day had come to you and said, all right, let's make a list of everything you're doing most poorly, and let's really focus on that. How demoralizing would that be? All right, so I was terrible at baseball, and I was okay at basketball, and I loved bicycling. Imagine if my, people who were involved in my life in sports had said, all right, Andy, baseball. We got to work on baseball. You're terrible at baseball, so you need to go out and do some more work on baseball. And maybe as a reward, you'll get to ride your bike a little bit. That would have been awful. Like, they should have said, let's work on biking, right? Well, why do we flip that when we go into situations of great poverty? So that would be just one example of a way of reframing what we're doing. We're building on strengths, and over time, then, we acquire the resources that allow us to solve some of these problems, as it were. How did I try to equip students at Harvard who were moving into careers of a lot of compensation and a lot of access and power? The biggest challenge was getting them to be aware that that was the reality. The funny thing about privilege, which I would define privilege as unconscious power, and that's what you have whenever you're a college student, actually. It's just as true at Patrick Henry College as it is at Harvard College. But there are additional layers of it at Harvard College, I will admit. For example, every student at Harvard College, if you divide out the endowment, every one of them has like a $600 million endowment slice of the pie that in some sense is like for them for the 4 years that they're there. I mean, that is one heck of a tailwind, right? And the thing about tailwinds is if you're moving at the speed of the tailwind, you don't feel like the wind is blowing at all. And this is how I would describe privilege. It's a tailwind, or it's the wind at your back that you don't feel. So when I was on my bike, when I'm out on my bike, even now, and I have a tailwind, I think I'm just doing great, right? I'm like, I'm like hitting, 22 miles an hour on this level stretch. This is a really great day. Well, the truth is I have a 7-mile-an-hour tailwind, but I'm not conscious of it. And if I'm not conscious of it, there are two things that become a problem. The first is that I'm not conscious of the temptations that come with it and the sort of acclimation or assimilation that's happening. I'm becoming very dependent on it. And the second is I don't see it as a resource. If you're not conscious of your privilege, you don't see it as a resource that can be used or misused. It's just reality for you. So for me, pastoring students at Harvard was all about surfacing the reality of privilege and then asking, okay, how do we steward this? What are the temptations? How are you tempted to shape your life to keep this privilege and protect it rather than to spend it? And then if you were to spend it, what would you spend it on? That would be truly investing in things that aren't going to wear out or burn out the way that wealth and power will. So that was part of what had to happen. And if I have time to add one sentence, at Harvard, I discovered why there are two versions of the Beatitudes. So the Luke version says, blessed are the poor, straight up. And that is true, because God cares for and is on the side of the poor. But the Matthew version says, blessed are the poor in spirit. And by definition, if you get into Harvard, you're not poor in the Lucan sense. But we had students who were poor in spirit, and the kingdom of God became real to them. We had students who came out of Harvard much more convinced the gospel was true than when they came in. And it's because they were willing to be poor in spirit. And amazing things happen when you're poor in spirit. So that was pastoring Harvard students, learning to be poor in spirit together.
And part of being poor in spirit also involves, I suspect, a sense of being rich in assets as opposed to detriments.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's paradoxically becoming aware I've been given just abundance. And that was, so at Harvard you had two big groups. You had the strivers and the legacies. Okay. So the legacies were the people who were multi-generation and probably had quite a tailwind, right, in the admissions process. And they tended to feel entitled to privilege. And then you had the strivers who, since preschool or maybe, in the womb had been, baby Einstein had been playing or whatever. And they, their whole life, had been taught you have to chase this stuff and grab it because other people are competing with you. And they were the people with backpacks hunched over both shoulders, like motoring along from the science center to the yard. And then there was this very small third group, which I started calling the children of grace. And they just had this sense that they were there as a gift. And that it was this kind of abundant thing they had not earned and did not deserve, neither one, but instead it was a gift. And they had this incredible freedom and humility and also often very high productivity because they weren't striving and they weren't entitled.
And a recognition that it's a gift also helps a person to be a happy warrior.
Exactly.
So-
Exactly.
Questions?
Yeah. Yes.
Hi. Earlier you were talking about being a representative in the King's Court to try to help affect change
Yes.
in a
Yes.
culture building kind of way.
Yeah.
It seems often though that a lot of the problems we're facing are kind of compounded by scale because you've got like
Yeah.
multinational
Well put.
corporations and big bureaucracies. So
Yep.
in some ways, as one person, you're basically sticking your finger in a mile-long dike full of mini holes. So I guess my question is, how do you build coalitions with like-minded people without falling into the same kind of problems that
Wow.
I guess the religious right did in the last generation?
Yes. Boy, that is a very, very perceptive statement of the problem. I was actually just with the owner of a financial services company that actually does derivatives for big clients. And he's trying to create a different way of handling these derivatives that's more honest, transparent, and safe in the right sense of the word. And we were talking about this, and he said in his view, our financial system is in incredible peril because of the concentration of power in very large organizations. And you're right. There is that goes way beyond what any one person can do in many ways. And so your question of how do you form coalitions without actually ending up with fatal compromises that actually undermine the reason you started the coalition in the first place? I'm tempted to say 4 words, I do not know, and leave it at that, because I'm not sure I know. I'm not sure we know. I would say humility would be a great place to start. And this is not my area of expertise, but my assessment of perhaps where the religious right took a wrong turn was not even just in its coalition partners and the extent to which it became beholden to them. But I think there was a naivete, and if I may say this, an arrogance and a triumphalism about the access that we were about to get that made perhaps that movement susceptible to fatal compromise and ineffective to the extent that it had power, to the extent it was able to plug a few holes in the dike, maybe it was undermined. And the biblical model of this, one biblical model is the story of Joseph. And the interesting thing about Joseph in Genesis 36 through 50 is Joseph ends up with that kind of access and power, but not before he has been radically humbled. He has these dreams of incredible influence, which actually come true. His brothers do come down and bow down to him at the end, just like he dreamed. But in the interim, 2 things happen. First of all, Joseph's family system, the dysfunctionality of it gets totally exposed, and he gets the wrong end of it by being thrown into this pit and trafficked into slavery. But I think more significantly, and we often forget this, Joseph, of course, then has this experience where his naivete about the power of sexuality is totally exploited by Potiphar's wife. He ends up in the dungeon, and in the dungeon, 2 people show up, the cupbearer and the baker and the cupbearer, I think it is. And both of these men have been placed in the dungeon totally arbitrarily at the whim of Pharaoh. And then they're both brought up, and Joseph has this dream, and the baker, I think, ends up with his head cut off, and the cupbearer goes back into the king's service. I think what happens in that moment is Joseph sees the complete unjust, arbitrary nature of the system of Egypt. These men are not given due process. It's not like there's a case, and the baker loses the case and the cupbearer, is declared innocent. There's just this totally arbitrary system, which Joseph has also suffered from. And that makes him kind of a profound realist about the system he's about to ascend into power into. And I think he's chastened by this series of experiences so that when he gets that access, he uses it for flourishing rather than just for self-interested or narrow kind of ends. That's the best I can do off the cuff.
Okay, thank you so much. Again, every page of that book has sort of been like this, an insight, a new paradigm to think with. It's a wonderful book. I urge you to get that. It's Playing God, Redeeming the Gift of Power. So if any of you would like to have lunch now with Andy Crouch and Dr. Olasky, you can get a free lunch pass from Mr. Hallbrook here. So I hope some of you can do that.